So I'd like to welcome you to our Future of Payment Systems, Government-to-Person Payments and Person-to-Government Payments webinar. This is actually an 8-part capacity building webinar series, together with the Presidency, focusing specifically on the employment stimulus, working together with the World Bank Group, ourselves, CBPEP and GTAC, and also the European Union. We've also got the Swiss with us, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the G2P program within the World Bank. So today's session is actually going to focus specifically on beneficiary-centric design. As we've gone through our journey, and this is the 6th session, part of our 8-part series, which actually looks at how you design payments and design programs specifically so that you actually wrap services around your client or around your beneficiary. So we've made this quite an important feature. Very often as governments, we tend to design things from a perspective of what we as governments seem to think is important, or particularly given what the Treasury guidelines say we should put in place when we develop business cases, but we very seldom put our customer, our client or the beneficiary at the center of our world and try and see what they actually want and how do we make it as convenient for them as possible. So today's journey is really around the digitization of payments, how we actually think about our beneficiaries and make sure that they are at the center of our universe. And given that we are looking at beneficiaries, we're particularly interested in digital identity, and so we've got a few guest speakers with us today. Specifically, if you can just put up the program ourselves. Thanks. So specifically today, we've got Anna Metz, who's actually at the World Bank, who's going to look at getting identity right for service delivery, how you maximize impact and mitigate risk. We then have Dianne Dunkerley from the South African Social Security Agency, who's actually going to look at the social relief grant and specifically the appeals process. And then because digital identity has come up quite a few times in the past and been raised by quite a few people within the sessions, we've got 2 sessions specifically looking at that. So we've got digital identity in South Africa. Max Sokolich from BankservAfrica is going to be presenting on what's currently being done within the banking environment and more broadly. And then we've actually got Mouton from Absa, who's actually going to be presenting on where identity is actually going and the future of identity, specifically focusing on self-sovereign identification and some of the work that Absa is actually doing. And then we've got Yoonyoung Cho from the World Bank, who's a senior economist there, and she'll actually be presenting the Philippines case study of beneficiary-centric design. And from there, we'll actually go on into a facilitated discussion. The standard rules, as I've mentioned before, for those of you that are new to this process, we don't run this as a pure webinar where you sit outside the room. You're in the room with us, so it's run in a meeting format. So if I can ask you to please keep your mics muted. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. We've tested the chat, it is working. Or please raise your hand. We're very happy to take your questions on that as we go through the process. Our speakers, when we get into the discussion phase, if you can please all turn on your videos, I would appreciate that. And obviously, as you're presenting, if you can please turn on your video. So please keep yourself muted, and I'm going to hand over to Anna. And from there, you know, Anna is actually the program officer at the World Bank and specifically working on the World Bank's identification for development specifically. And she's also done quite a bit of work in Africa and Asia on implementing and modernizing identity systems. Anna has been with us before, for those of you that have followed us through this journey. So we're very happy to have you back, Anna, and we welcome you. So Marceli, if you can just start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back. I'll wait for the presentation to come up, and then I get started. All right. Thank you very much. So as Kathy mentioned, I'm from the World Bank's Identification for Development, or ID4D initiative. Perhaps to give you a very brief introduction about the program that we're working with. So ID4D is, just like ID systems, very much a cross-sectoral initiative that brings together 10 different parts of the World Bank, including finance, competitiveness and innovation, digital development, social protection and jobs, gender, and operates across 3 pillars of work, including thought leadership and analytics, which produces original research on all kind of questions and issues related to identification, from technology to data protection, to legal aspects, to enrollment practices, as well as the second pillar being global platforms and convening, which provides tools for ID practitioners and policymakers, and looks at things like standards and open source application and supports their development. And the World Bank and ID4D is also, of course, active in terms of country engagement and regional action, supporting countries with technical assistance and financings to strengthen their ID systems. And as Kathy mentioned, next slide, please. Today, we will be talking about how ID systems can be used for better service delivery and what are the key kind of success factors and challenges to ensure people-centric and service-oriented design. And perhaps to get us started, I thought it would be good to give an overview of the different components or stages of a modern ID system. And especially, I think, over the last 2 decades or 3 decades, we have seen huge changes in terms of both the needs for identification systems and also in parallel, a lot of evolution of ID technologies and the capabilities of the systems. As we have seen government programs become much bigger in scale in terms of their reach and also more centralized in the administration. In terms of the financial sector, we have seen the requirements for identification tighten, but at the same time also financial services being extended to kind of new sections of the population and becoming more accessible. And of course, as people are also becoming more mobile, moving, globally moving from across different towns, even within their own countries, this has brought up a lot of new needs for the ID systems. And perhaps one way to think about these new demands is a Maslow pyramid of ID needs and capabilities on the slides, where you have ID systems underpinned by strong institutional, legal enablers and safeguards. And at the first level, you have what we sometimes call foundational ID systems and registers. These are national ID systems and civil registries or population registers that serve as the authoritative sources of basic identity about the person. But then going beyond just these registries and databases, increasingly countries are building improved identity services and service providers, and people are demanding these identity services and digital identity services, which enable reliable identity verification remotely, that allows service providers to ping the ID database or use some kind of digital authentication using a credential, such as a QR code or a chip on a smart card. And also at the same time, enabling people to have more oversight and control over how their data is shared and to consent to identity verification. And then kind of at the top, we have the true digital identity. What we mean by that is digital identity for online and remote transactions that really enables people to securely authenticate themselves from the comfort of their couch, essentially, and for service providers to interact securely with people remotely. And in this field, we're also seeing a lot of innovative approaches emerge, and I think we will hear more of that also from other speakers today, in terms of the decentralization, the use of digital ID wallets, also in terms of federation, in terms of private sector or public sector providers themselves building on this foundational ID systems and registries to become ID providers themselves. Next slide, please. And then one way we can also conceptualize these changes is that we're really seeing a paradigm shift in identification and digital ID, where we're moving from a traditional approach to ID, where the national ID systems or population registers were primarily a repository of data and used to issue physical credentials like ID cards for in-person transactions, where there was a lot of emphasis of large amounts of data collection, where the role of the ID provider was often very closely linked to nationality, legal status, and elections, and this was also the primary focus of identity provision, and the architecture very much built around centralization and not necessarily designed for interoperability, and kind of now moving into the 21st century approach, where ID systems are seen more as a platform for service delivery and are to be designed as a platform for service delivery and also for empowering people to have control over their data and to be able to transact both in person and online in a more secure way. And here we're also seeing changes in terms of data management towards data minimization, the inclusion of privacy by design aspects from the beginning, as well as kind of the role of the ID system, whereas there's obviously still need for the nationality, legal status, and elections as use cases and components of identity management, but they're also being kind of additional layers or additional focus or much more pronounced focus about the verification aspects, the online transaction aspects, and the service delivery aspects that ID can provide. And this is then also reflected in the architecture trends that we are seeing of ID systems becoming more modular, more use of open standards and open source, and also possible separation of the kind of identification layer, the one that's around registration and basic identity data, and then the authentication services, which can be sitting on top of that. Next slide, please. And one way that this has been conceptualized and perhaps is illustrative of the vision is this digital stack concept, whereby built on the foundations of connectivity, capacity, skills, and electricity, the different ID, data sharing, and financial services come together as rails for a digital economy that can are interoperable with each other and that work together for better service delivery, really looking to enable a paperless, remote, cashless, and data-empowered transactions. And there are a number of countries like India and Singapore that have already implemented this stack and are keep kind of improving on the stack concept and making sure that these different platforms are working together seamlessly. Next slide, please. And what we have seen is, of course, that when ID systems, payment systems, and interoperability are given and can work together with different services, ID can really improve service delivery for people, can help the efficiency of service delivery for service providers across many, many sectors, including financial services, including healthcare, including social protection, and many more here. These are just a few examples here. Obviously, for financial services, ID is very important for KYC requirements. And as the example of also India has shown, kind of with improved identity verification, it can also be an important driver of financial inclusion. Kind of one telling data point from India is that between 2011 and 2017, bank account ownership jumped from 35% to 80%, and this was also in great part enabled by the introduction of digitally verifiable ID, the Aadhaar. In healthcare, we have also seen a lot of kind of ID being an enabler, a lot of improvements and expanding possibilities, both in terms of patient management and being able to uniquely identify patients across healthcare services and being able to deliver better quality care because people records are connected through the systems of different facilities, and also in terms of expanding health insurance coverage, for example, in Thailand, by being able to cross-reference different registries using the national ID as a common identifier, as a common reference, and making sure that anyone who was not covered by a scheme became covered eventually. And similarly in social protection, national ID systems or population registers can be very helpful to identify who needs help and also to make sure that the right people receive the help, for example, better targeting programs to women or certain vulnerable groups, and also making sure that any leakages are reduced. Next slide, I think we jumped a couple of slides. So I wonder if, yes, this one. Oh, sorry. Yes, exactly. And so just continuing also from the more perhaps in-person services, as mentioned before, ID systems and especially the digital ID layer can be a driver for many new opportunities from remote transactions to cashless transactions and to data empowerment. And there are, again, many countries that have already utilized these digital ID functions. Estonia, for example, introduced an eID in 2002 and is able to provide 99% of government services currently online, which is saving the average resident over 5 days a year. And there are some estimates that it's saving 2% of the country's GDP through these kind of very extensive e-governance frameworks. Similarly, for cashless transactions, for example, if the ID number can be used as a financial identifier and facilitate financial transactions and cash transfers, this can be a huge driver for all kinds of like digital economy aspects, and also for data empowerment. The ID system can help people share information about themselves more on their own terms and ensure that they have the control over secure documents and secure identity information. Next slide, please. And we've, of course, also seen the power of ID systems and the importance of having not just ID systems, but this whole stack in place of payment systems and interoperability frameworks for the COVID-19 response and recovery efforts, where expanding social assistance and government-to-person payments has been paramount, and countries with good ID system have been able to enable remote enrollment into programs to ensure uniqueness of people in these programs and to facilitate cross-checks for eligibility checking, and also, for example, support bank account opening remotely, as well as authentication at the point of assistance and cash out. And similarly, we are now seeing ID also enabling health and vaccine delivery, everything from facilitating pre-registration for vaccine recipients to the certification of vaccination, after that, and tying the vaccination record to a trusted real-life identity. And of course, in terms of remote service delivery, as many countries imposed quarantines and lockdowns, being able to offer services online and to access services online has become more important than ever. Next slide, please. Just in the interest of time, I don't want to go through this slide in detail, but here are just some examples of how countries like India and Thailand and Peru have been able to leverage their ID systems together with payment systems to kind of really scale up their social protection programs during the COVID-19 pandemic, enabling people to enroll remotely or even just automating enrollment based on the data that was already available and the registries that were already available, and do eligibility checks also remotely through cross-referencing different databases, and then also being able to deliver payments into digital accounts that were often linked to the ID, or in case where this was not possible, or in case where people were mostly looking to cash out payments, use the ID and the authentication services offered by the ID to ensure that the payments went to the right beneficiaries and reached the right beneficiaries. Next slide, please. And of course, these kind of impacts and these benefits or dividends from service delivery are not guaranteed. So it's important that ID systems are designed in a certain way to really facilitate this service delivery and digital transformation. So what are these key aspects? Next slides, please. So for an inclusive digital economy, it's important that ID systems and digital ID solutions are accessible, that everyone is able to prove who they are, both in person and online, that identities are verifiable or verified in the sense that they are accurate, unique, and that identity information is trusted by all parties. Also that people's rights and personal information are protected. And of course, also that the ID systems are service-oriented and people-centric, in that the ID system works as an open platform and useful for people in public-private sectors, and also that for people it's easy to use their credentials and that they have real choice and control over their data. Next slide, please. At the same time, we also need to be considering and mitigating against serious risks when it comes to identification, including the risk of exclusion, that some people may not be able to get an ID or use their IDs, whether these are kind of physical or online credentials. Of course, privacy violations are very important as we see greater use of digital data, more data sharing between service providers. And vendor lock-in is also something, given that this is a fairly specialized field, this is something that can be a challenge in terms of making sure that that government entities or other entities are not logged into a a solution provider, that can then lead to increased cost or less flexibility in terms of any adaptation to the systems. And of course, additional challenges also need to be considered, such as any inequalities in terms of internet connectivity, the need to overcome sectoral silos, as well as lower implementation capacity in certain areas such as cybersecurity or different technology aspects. How can we meet these requirements and mitigate the risks? One framework that the World Bank has helped facilitate, but has been a joint effort with different international organizations, private sector, entities, as well as researchers and kind of different civil society organizations, is the Principles of Identification for Sustainable Development. These 10 principles are a blueprint for what good ID looks like, both online and offline. And it has now been endorsed by over 30 partners. Next slide, please. The gist of the principles, it's around 3 pillars. One around inclusion. I said before that ID systems need to be accessible for all. Then about the components of good design, including the accuracy and uniqueness of IDs, the platform nature of ID systems, the use of standards, and as well as the need for privacy and data protection. And this is then also reflected in the governance pillar to ensure that ID systems are underpinned by good kind of data governance frameworks, legal frameworks, as well as strong institutions with clear mandates. Next slide. Just in the interest of time, yes, let's skip ahead. So, and then just looking at from principles to practice, what we have seen in terms of good practices and challenges from a number of countries when it comes to implementing these principles and what are good things to watch out for. So one, for benefits across sectors and for benefits for people, it's important that foundational ID systems are inclusive. It's, as the first part, it's important to address any kind of coverage gaps in the sense of if the population register national ID system excludes or is not accessible for a large part of the population, then obviously it will not be able to serve the different sectors such as the healthcare, social protection, etc. well, and cannot be used as this authoritative source of data. And cost, distance, and administrative complexity are often key barriers that need to be addressed. When there is no universal access, then it will also be, this can create exclusion for service delivery. And one, I think, good practice that we have seen in countries is that often the service points in terms of service providers can become themselves enrollment points. So a lot of coordination and collaboration is encouraged between service providers, which can be banks, which can be social protection programs, so that if people are unable to prove their identity, there is some kind of referral in place to enable inclusion in the ID system. And of course, human-centered design and providing people with control and oversight of their data is also a key element of the inclusive design. Now onto the slide that we already have now, it's of course also that for systems to be able to serve people and service providers well, they need to be trusted. Here one challenge is about low levels of accuracy of data, especially for dynamic data fields such as address, or for example, phone number, if those are used for authentication in terms of one-time passwords. And that's something that kind of mechanisms needs to be put in place to encourage people to update their data regularly and to update their data in a convenient manner. And strengthening authentication mechanisms is also important, offering a lot of different authentication mechanisms, whether it's through biometrics, whether it's through mobile phones and one-time passwords, or whether it's through other means. And at the same time, again, it's important to balance fraud preventions against the need for accessibility for all and assess the trade-offs to make sure that a system that is fully fraud-proof is probably not a system that can be fully inclusive. And this is also where exception handling and grievance redress mechanisms play a key role. And as mentioned before, the protection of privacy and data security by default is also critical, both to build trust in the system among people as well as among the service providers. And here there are a number of tools and mechanisms that serve this, from data minimization to the tokenization of the root ID number, encryption, etc. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Marcel? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And so obviously for these benefits to be reaped, it's also important that the foundation ID systems are interoperable with different service providers. This is, on the one hand, this can help reduce redundancies and yield a lot of savings in the sense of the foundation ID system being used for onboarding, for the basic identity verification, as well as authentication mechanisms, and to ensure that the uniqueness of identities across sectoral databases. And at the same time, this is also important to keep kind of minimization of data across registries in mind, so that instead of creating, a super database of all information. It's kind of good practice for privacy and data protection for each sectoral, for each sector to have their own information and only keep the minimal information that they need for their own purposes. And for it's through the data sharing and interoperability, if cross-checks need to be made, that these can be made, rather than having all data in one single system. Next slide, please. And then to develop an interoperability framework, of course, this requires high-level coordination. And because there are many aspects to it, it's not just the technical aspects of it, but it's also the legal, organizational, and semantic aspects that need to be considered. And it's usually a complex and multi-stakeholder process to agree on all the proposed changes and also the implementation of any changes that are needed given the existing and legacy systems across all of these funds. And next slide, please. I realize that I'm going fast, so I think the slides will be shared. You can all look at it in more detail, but I wanted to make sure that we don't run too much over time. And so just to conclude, some of the main success factors for service-oriented and people-centric design when it comes to ID systems are, one, really understanding the priorities, needs, and concerns of people and service providers who will be the users of the system, conducting needs assessment research, and trying to really make then the design adapted to these needs and defining the specifications and requirements adapted to these needs. And number two is making these design choices based on the desired outcomes and the needs and use cases rather than a particular technology. I think there are many technologies that provide huge benefits, but at the same time, it's important not to be carried away by any particular hype, but really kind of keep the outcomes and needs in mind. The number three, ensure sustained coordination and commitment across different stakeholders, and make sure that there are clear mandates and roles across institutions. This is really important both for facilitating interoperability. As mentioned, that is very much a multi-stakeholder effort that needs to happen. And number four, incorporating a privacy by design approach from beginning rather than as an afterthought. And this is both important for maintaining trust and also for ensuring inclusion. And this can also help people, empower people with more control over their data and more kind of oversight over how their data is being used. The number five, I think it's very important to always think of choices and alternatives when designing an ID systems or offering different credentials or authentication mechanisms. It's unlikely that any single solution will work well for all people that the ID system looks to serve, or all service providers who may be building on the ID system. So it's always good to differentiate solutions and try to think of a plan B and this exception handling and grievance redress for those for whom certain solutions may not work. And then six is obviously any changes or updates to an ID system or to an overall kind of digital transformation project will require a lot of trial and error. So being able to monitor, review, and fine-tune processes and technologies is very important, and in that sense, being tolerant to failure, but at the same time, being able to address that failures and correct them when they come up is very important for success. That's it from me. Thank you very much. And for any more resources, I also encourage you to visit our website at id4d.worldbank.org. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna. I think you've given us a very nice framework to start off with and a good sort of frame and starting point. So I think in the question and answer session, I'd like to ask a question a little bit around cybersecurity and identity theft and how we sort of counter that. So just something to think about. Moving on, Marcel, if you can put up Dianne Dunkerley's sort of profile, if that's okay. So Di is actually she's been at the South African Social Security Agency for as long as I can remember. I think Di and I started together in 2006, and she's been at Social Development prior to that. And she's actually going to be presenting specifically on the appeals process for the Social Relief of Distress Grant. So Di, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kathy, and good afternoon to everybody. As we heard in the previous presentation, the ability to identify people uniquely is absolutely critical And I think as we implemented the 350 grant, the special relief grant, as a response to COVID, this became really more apparent. And I'm going to go through quite quickly around the appeal process that we brought in specifically. So I'll look, just to set the background, look at the process of validations that we do, but then the right to recourse, which is really important, as Kathy was saying at the beginning, that we really put our beneficiary at the center so that they have the ability to challenge any decision that is made by government. And that's the right of recourse that we talk about. And then I will talk about how we've implemented the reconsideration process and some of the lessons that we've learned and how we can improve. So firstly, with the implementation of the 350 grant, we've been able to get information of about 14, very nearly 15 million citizens that we didn't have before. Now, every single one of those applications is validated on a monthly basis and we do it on a monthly basis rather than saying this grant is in place until March of next year. So if you qualify once, you're going to get the grant for the full 8 months. It's because people's circumstances change. And particularly as the response to the pandemic changes, people are able to get work, they're able to start looking at being able to provide for themselves and so on. So we do a monthly validation against a number of different databases, including our National Population Register, which looks at the personal information, so names, IDs, even marital status, to make sure we've got that right. Then we look at SOCPEN, just to make sure that the applicants are not receiving a grant other than the child grant. With this iteration of the grant, they can receive the child grant, which is clearly for the support of a child and not of the adult. So as long as they're not receiving an adult grant for themselves, they could get the 350 grant. We also look at the SARS IRP5 data. This is important because we need to know who is employed, who's been employed and could possibly have made provision for themselves. However, there are certainly challenges with this data, and I will speak about that a little bit later. We look at the UIF data, and that is to determine whether the applicant is either a contributor, so they're currently employed and still contributing to UIF, or whether they're actually receiving a benefit from UIF, which would exclude them from receiving the 350 grant. We look at the National Student Financial Aid Scheme to determine those people who are in receipt of a stipend, and they would be excluded because they are being supported by government. Whether it is sufficient or not, I think, is a discussion for a different day, but it just says we can't support people twice. We also look at the government employees databases to make sure that even people employed as interns or EPWP workers or contract workers in government are not able to access the relief grant. And then certainly the government employees pension fund database to make sure that they're not getting a pension, and then the correctional services database to make sure that they're not an inmate in a correctional institution where they would be on a voluntary or involuntary basis, but they're already being supported by government. Now, we have picked up challenges with the various databases used. It is important to use information that's available because it's the only way you can deal with these kind of numbers for validation very quickly. But certainly we found that there have been both inclusion and exclusion errors. The inclusion errors are largely because we assess people as an individual. Now, it could be, for example, a housewife who is supported by her husband, or a young person that is still supported by parents who have sufficient income to do it. But we're unable to determine household income or spousal income or parental income. And therefore, we deal with this grant as an individual. And certainly there may be some inclusion errors that come as a result of that. We do, as I said, have exclusion errors because, and this is largely as a result of inaccurate or databases that are not necessarily current. The IRP5 database is an example of that, where it will tell you who was employed or who contributed over the last tax year, but it doesn't tell you who is contributing today. So those are some of the challenges. And I think the next table just gives more information on some of the challenges with the various databases that we've received. Certainly with the social grants, we don't have an issue. It's information within our own environment. It is something that we can control, and we know that it is current. It's a real-time database that we use there. So that one is not a problem. Correctional services, not major problems, but there may be timing issues, particularly with people who are released from the correctional facilities or who go out on parole, that may still reflect on the database. The government employees, again, fairly straightforward, but there are again some timing issues where people don't necessarily capture the resignations or exit from government employment timeously, and then we may find that we are excluding people based on inaccurate information. The NSFAS, we do seem to have some challenges with this one, and again, it's really around the currency of the information, that it does seem to include people who've been approved but not necessarily receiving the stipend. And these are ongoing discussions we have with the owners of the databases. The UIF, which is one of our biggest reasons for excluding people from receiving the relief grant, is really, it remains a challenge, despite the fact that we really have a very good relationship with UIF and we're receiving refreshed databases on a monthly basis. There is still challenges with information of people who are not currently employed or have not been employed for some time, still reflecting on this database. The National Population Register is not a major problem, but what we are picking up now is that particularly with some married women who choose to retain their maiden surname, that is not reflected on the population register. And then we will exclude them because the data doesn't match, and yet it's a perfectly legal and legitimate reason for it not being matched. And then the IRP5 that I've spoken about, it talks about the last tax year. It's updated on a biannual basis, and some of that information is not necessarily current. And then we also looked at other databases in other environments which are not applicable for this round of the grant, purely because those departments are not necessarily providing support related to the pandemic anymore. Thank you. If we then go and look at why it is important to have a right of recourse. Firstly, it is important that any citizen who is not happy with the decision that is made by government has the right to challenge that decision. We can't just say, sorry, we're the government, what we say goes, and you have to take it or leave it. This is also encompassed in the Administrative Justice Act. So it's important for us to have something that is legislatively compliant, but puts the beneficiary at the center. So because of this, together with, in consultation with Social Development Department, we've implemented a reconsideration process. So for every applicant where their application is declined for that month, and it's important that they understand that they need to do this on a monthly basis, because this is a month-by-month grant. It's not a grant that is given for an extended period. So for every month that the application is declined, the applicant must lodge a request for reconsideration. Again, this is done completely remotely. They do it on our website, and they just make sure that they do lodge that request every month, even if the previous month's request for reconsideration has not yet been attended to. And I think this is what creates confusion with some people, because they say, but I was declined in August because I'm on the UIF database. I've lodged a reconsideration. I'm declined in September again because I'm on the UIF database, but I've lodged a reconsideration for that reason. So why must I do it again? But as I say, this is a month-to-month grant, and it really is important that they do that on a monthly basis. If we don't get the request for reconsideration, then we're not able to reconsider it. So if we look at the process that we follow for reconsideration, every declined grant is means tested. Now, there has been a delay with this. We're finalizing all the issues with the banks, but effectively it means every declined application is sent to all the banks to see whether they have an account for this ID number, and they send back information to SASSA to say, yes, this person has an account, and the inflow into that account in the month preceding the grant application was more than $5.95 per month, which is the new means test threshold for this grant, or less than. And we would take that and we just maintain that information. When the banks look at the means testing, they exclude the income from social grants. So there's an indicator to say if this income is from a social grant, So it doesn't necessarily exclude people who should not be. Then we go, and if for those people whose application was declined and they've requested a reconsideration, we then take those, and before we look at the means test data, we look at the refreshed databases that we've received, because generally by the time the reconsideration request is being dealt with, the data that we have is 2 months more recent than the data that was used to make that decision. If we no longer find them on the database, clearly they would then qualify for the grant, and we will approve that reconsideration request and pay them. However, if they're still found on the databases, and this is important for databases that don't change very regularly or very often, we then go and check against the means test responses that we've received. So where there is no inflow into an account, or if no account could be found for that person, then we would approve and pay the grant. But if we do find that there's been an inflow, we then make sure that it is above the $595 per month. And if it is above that, then the application is declined. The reconsideration process that is applied by SASSA is a final decision. There isn't another appeal decision beyond that decision made by SASSA. However, anybody who is still dissatisfied is able to follow a legal route. So they can still challenge the decisions that we made, and we would have to be able to justify the decisions that we have made. And that is the process that we follow to try and make sure that we do implement a beneficiary-centric process and provide the opportunities for them to challenge decisions that we have made. Thanks so much, Kathy.
Super, Dianne. There are 2 questions for you. I don't know if you want to maybe take them just quite briefly. Lena, do you want to maybe ask your question? No, she's not responding. So the question is, are the bank accounts of beneficiaries receiving the SRD payments into their accounts also checked on a monthly basis to determine income? There appears to be conflicting information on this and whether bank balances of beneficiaries are checked as part of their monthly validation process. There's another question, which is there currently an average cost to beneficiaries to go through the appeals process, whether time or money? And then finally, Victoria, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, thanks, Kathy. This is Victoria Montrak from the World Bank. I was wondering, the monthly validation, Dianne, is that a new thing for the second phase of the SRD grant, or did you always use that also in the first phase that started in May 2020? And then for the other grant programs, once the applicants apply, are they also reassessed at some frequency, or do they continue on the grant, for example, as long as they have a child under 18? Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much for those questions. I should be able to respond. The first are the bank accounts for the people that are approved and have the grant paid into it, whether we check them. We don't routinely check them, because by the time we deposit the money into the bank account, we've confirmed that they actually qualify for that grant. We've done all the other checks and balances. However, one of the things that we are looking at as we move forward is to do a once-off means testing of the entire population. And this is necessary, particularly if this grant is going to continue in some form or another going forward, to try and identify the areas of inclusion, where there are people who have money in bank accounts or who get regular money into bank accounts that we're not picking up through the other validations we need. However, that has not been done yet. It is something that we intend doing within the next month or so. Whether bank balances are validated, no. We don't look at the balance of the money in the bank account. We look at the inflow into that account, because this grant is clearly legislated to say that nobody must have an income. Now, one of the challenges with that too is that an inflow into the account doesn't show whether it is in fact income or not. It just shows that there's been money into this account. And some of the challenges that we get is that somebody says, well, I'm the only one in my family who has a bank account. and therefore my granny put money in to give to my mother to help support us, or my brother sent me money because he's employed and it's just to help me over this difficulty that I'm going through. We can't see who put the money in or what it was put in for, but we just have to work on an inflow through that bank account. The question around costs for beneficiaries to request reconsideration, there's no monetary cost. There is a time cost because of the delay in us receiving the request for reconsiderations and being able to reconsider and provide an outcome. And now, particularly for somebody who really doesn't have any other method of support, that time delay is very stressful. And so certainly there is a time cost to the beneficiaries, but not a monetary cost at all. The question around the monthly validations, this has been done since this grant was introduced. And it is because we know that circumstances can change over a very short period of time, and therefore we do monthly validations, and we have done since the beginning of the grant. For the other social grants, they also have a reconsideration and an appeal process. We also, in terms of the legislation, have regular intervals at which we are able to review. It's not set to say that your grant will be reviewed every year or every second year. There are intervals that we're able to review the grant at, we really review the grants where there is a possibility that a change could happen. There are certain social grants that are never going to change, and they're really why you would want to review those is a question. We certainly do life certification to confirm that the person is still alive to receive the grant, but we don't necessarily do a full review. But where we do believe, for example, if somebody provided information on income when they applied for the grant, there's a very real possibility that that could change over time, and those are the kinds of grants we would then review. Thank you so much.
And Lena, just as an addition to her question, I don't know if you can unmute, Lena. Can you unmute?
Yes, thank you. I think I can unmute now. Yeah, thanks for answering the first question. And yeah, just a quick follow-up question with regards to whether or to what extent beneficiaries are informed why their application was declined. I know that wasn't initially the case, and obviously I understand that's also quite difficult to do from a systems point of view. But at the same time, that obviously does make it difficult for beneficiaries to, for example, address the issue of money for the granny coming into a bank account and being excluded on that basis. So yeah, perhaps you could just provide some information on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is one of the lessons that we learned from the first implementation of the grant, that although the reason for the decline is on the system, it wasn't necessarily sent to each person who has been declined. So what we do now on a monthly basis, as we process those applications, anybody whose grant application is declined receives an SMS to say your application for September has been declined because you're found on the you are found on the UIF database, or you are a government employee. There obviously is a limit to the amount of information you can give on an SMS, and because this is a completely electronic system, we are limited in terms of the communication, but we do make sure that everybody is informed. We also then send a follow-up SMS to every one of those clients to remind them of their right of reconsideration and give them the link to be able to go and lodge that reconsideration.
Super, thanks, Tav. Thanks so much, Tav. That was excellent and very insightful, and it's nice to see sort of the progress and the developments always sort of changing as we go, trying to iterate and improve our service delivery. I'm going to hand over to Max, who's actually been at BankServ for a decade and basically has worked on developing, implementing and managing various products within the payments products or a service offering at BankServ. The next two presentations really look at digital identification in South Africa and where we're heading with it. So Max, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and appreciate you guys offering that we could come and share with what we're busy with. Just want to share my screen.
Great, if you can just put it into presentation mode. Excellent, Max, we can see it.
We're good to go. Excellent. Thank you, everyone, for allowing us the opportunity to present where we are in terms of digital identity and what we've been busy with in terms of the community, having a look at digital identity specifically within South Africa. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of an update of what we did as part of our phase 1, and then I'll get on to what we're busy with currently and what we're trying to achieve. So just in terms of our journey to date, we started off, well, there was a South African Financial Blockchain Consortium, which was created and started in 2016, which was looking at digital identity. BankservAfrica actually played a part in the blockchain consortium in looking and unpacking how blockchain could be used and how digital identity could turn out within South Africa. There's been quite a large amount of work, that's been done in this space. You can see starting in 2016, moving through to 2019, where there was a proposal on the self-sovereign identity platform, related solutions and prototypes, which we were also part of, and was made up of mostly financial services players. In April of 2020, we actually also tried to assist. We put a proposal forward on the COVID-19 special grant in terms of the data management and monitoring solution. And that's just to let you know that we're trying to look at these type of services. And we were approached mid-2020 by the South African Blockchain Consortium and asked whether we couldn't start unlocking conversations with the broader industry within the banking sector and financial services sector, which we gladly accepted, and we kicked off some discussions. We held a webinar and a breakfast in August of 2020, and we continued conversations with that group around the time until around March. And during this period, we started realizing that the people interested in digital identity were not just limited to the financial sector, and that there was interest growing from various sectors, and it soon became a community discussion as opposed to just an industry discussion. And I'll go through some of the people that have joined the conversations and joined the community in terms of unpacking what is required from a South African perspective. In April, we started engaging the community and unpacking the blocks around what is this South African digital identity story. And out of that, we developed a report. That report, I will take you through the process of how that was developed with the community. Just to kick off, we actually partnered with PwC. BankservAfrica did that for two reasons. Firstly, to bolster our resources, but secondly, so that we had an independent and a neutral partner, which was able to contribute to the conversations that were being held within the community. And the approach we took was we conducted interviews, we ran surveys, and we ran these focus group discussions, after which we then socialized those outputs with the community. You can see we've listed a couple of the community members. That has now grown to over 54 institutions and continues to grow almost on a daily basis. Just in terms of some of the outcomes, what should be the proposed digital identity ecosystem was one of the main things that was discussed. And the community came up that they said it should be a hybrid ecosystem that combines the strength of both a centralized and a self-sovereign identity solution. So we're busy unpacking that, and I'll get into a little bit more of that because we're doing that as part of our phase 2 later in the presentation. What should be the key use cases for the South African digital identity? Out of phase 1, it was eKYC, digital onboarding, and digital signatures. The focus areas there were financial services, social benefits, and healthcare. We're actually busy now actually checking on whether those are still the use cases that need to be used, and that's busy being unpacked with the community itself. Who will be the key stakeholders in the South African digital identity ecosystem? There's been a lot of questions asked around the Department of Home Affairs and the role that the community saw them playing. We see them as the owners or the golden source of identity for South African citizens. None of that changes. And there could be multiple credential providers supported and governed by a trust framework, but those will lend to the digital identity itself. What will be the proposed framework? We believe that there needs to be an appointment of a scheme operator or administrator that provides leadership and is supported by a board to provide oversight of this environment. What should the overall technology framework considerations be? So the community felt that it should be a distributed ledger technology, which is scalable and is tamper-proof and can avoid cyber attacks or any other threats. Excuse me. Just in terms of the business objectives for the project and what we want to try and achieve as part of our phase 2 is firstly obtaining stakeholder support and buy-in for the solution. The measure of success there is developing an engagement model and looking at the stakeholder mapping, active participation, and we've seen it. And I'll take you through a little bit of what we've asked for from the community a little bit later, but we've asked for them to come forward with their resources and to participate actively so that we come up with making sure that we have support for the solution and everyone's voices are heard. Establish the validity and make sure that the solution's sustainable. In doing this, we'll measure that there'll be a business management plan, looking at a funding model, so perhaps seeing if we can obtain funding, and then producing a business case and commercial case for this digital identity solution. Then we want to achieve the citizens, because without consumer adoption, this would go nowhere. I think it was mentioned up front in the first presentation. It was one of the key points that I took out of it was if we don't have that consumer adoption and people aren't using the solution, we're going to struggle. Establishing the scheme and the business architecture, so agreeing a trust model with the community, ensuring that the rules and legal and scheme participation and in-state is all put together and solid for the solution. Establishing the technical architecture. So yeah, the measure of success is creating that interoperability between the various players within the ecosystem, understanding the hybrid model and making sure that we're using viable use cases. In terms of how we'll measure it is the technical viability and the end-to-end transactions. So making sure that that request for digital identity goes through the entire process. Just in terms of the next phase, we're going to deliver this across 3 streams. We had a business stream, we have a governance stream, and a technology work stream. And you can see that there's a large amount of planning that needs to go into this, as well as the initiation. And in terms of the initiation, the approval of the business case under the work stream and the confirmation of the commercial model is what we're focusing on there. On the governance work stream side, it's defining that trust model. And then in the technology work stream is setting up a sandbox environment which allows for the community to start testing these various use cases and ensuring that they work between the communities. Again, I don't want to hop on around the key dependencies, but the community participation, the sandbox environment being available, key stakeholder participation, the likes of the DHA, regulators, and perhaps other government departments. We've maintained an open door policy, and we continue to do so and invite anyone that has an interest in digital identity and would like to add to the community and the outcomes to please join us. The membership in governance, and then the policy and legislation frameworks. In terms of the next steps, and we look at phase 2 here. So we have to go through these stages of planning, the initiation and setup, as well as design. Some of the key considerations around the planning is the alignment on the use cases from the community. And that's where we are at the moment, because everything that we do going forward from here will revolve around what use cases have been selected. And this will drive the business case, drive the commercial model. We won't be able to cater for all use cases from the get-go, but we will certainly make sure that we have a parking lot and we start bringing on use case by use case as the digital identity ecosystem grows. Finalizing the digital identity ecosystem architecture, resourcing and infrastructure for the technical design, designing a charter for the advisory board, the program calendar, of course, preparing for the meetings with the community and the DHA and other departments, and facilitation sessions on the sandbox that need to be scheduled. And I'll take you through some of the scheduled sessions that have been put in place already. But just to touch on some of the tangible outcomes, is that finalized digital identity architecture is what we're after, the advisory board charter, finalizing the use cases for the POC. In terms of the initiation and setup, building the business case for digital identity program, as well as the pricing model and the governance system. And then in terms of the design, a go-to-market plan with a trust framework for the digital identity ecosystem, and high-level technical design documents. What we have put out to the community, and this is where we've asked for them to commit where they're able to their different resources across the business, technical, and governance streams, is that we're looking for approximately 80 hours from their resources over the 3 streams until February 2022, the end of February 2022. And the business stream, we're looking for the type of project managers that should be involved and participating in the stream. In the governance stream, we're looking for legal, regulatory, and compliance sort of resources. And then, of course, in the technical stream, we're looking for the guys that understand the technologies and understand how to design within this work stream, depending on the use cases that are selected. Just some of the upcoming working group sessions that we have. So we actually held one yesterday in which we started unpacking the use cases. We'll be finalizing those use cases on Friday. We will be doing this with the community, and you can see the attendees that we have involved there span across all 3 of our streams. Then on the 29th of November, we'll be kicking off a discussion, still business focused, but having a look at the ecosystem framework and the validation and finalization thereof. And then we will start moving more towards the technical side, in which we want to start unpacking the infrastructure and environment that is required from a technology perspective. On the digital, and then the final session for this year would be the governance session, in which we start looking and unpacking the trust framework. So I know I've gone through it pretty quickly. What we will be doing is making the digital identity report, which was an outcome or an output of phase 1 within our space. We will be making that available through the Presidential Employment Stimulus website. So we will share that with the organizers, who will put it up and make it available. But should anyone want to perhaps ask other questions or reach out to us, you're welcome to reach out directly to myself, or you can come through to our centralized mailbox.
Super, thanks. We will definitely be sharing that paper along with the CBPEP recordings and presentations to this particular session, Max, as well. So moving on to Sean. Sean is actually the Chief Technology Manager and Head of R&D at Absa, and is actually working in a very exciting area on self-sovereign identification. So Sean, I'm going to hand over to you to actually put up your first video. And the intention of this sort of slot is really to show you where identification is actually going, and some of the progress that South Africa has made in this space. So over to you, Sean.
Oh, hey, I take it you guys can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'll start with the video.
So driver say soon a program in it.
Okay, so I'll start with the video. This talks to of Max's presentation of 2019 when we started the journey. And this was a presentation or demo that we actually did at the last IFWG conference that took place in Sandton.
Self-sovereign identity is a way for people and businesses to store and update their digital identity information on their own devices and share it with those who need to validate it. Having your own self-sovereign identity means that you can hold, update, and share your own verifiable credentials, much the same way you currently do with paper documents like your passport or proof of residence, but in a digital and privacy-safe way. In the financial services environment, self-sovereign identity solutions can be used by staff and customers whenever they engage with their bank. For example, in customer onboarding, during the Know Your Customer process, for consent receipts, bank statements, and more. The use of self-sovereign identities can also lower transaction costs, protect people's personal information, and limit the opportunity for cybercrime. More importantly, they promote financial inclusion. By lowering the cost to banks of opening accounts, financing becomes more profitable and therefore more accessible. The following video clip is a technical demonstration of a proof of concept for a new open source-based digital identity management app. The demo aims to showcase the potential of self-sovereign identity solutions, as well as show how these tools connect to and use distributed ledger technology. This proof of concept is designed for the South African environment and includes three main components: a mobile application, which has been built by Absa Group Limited, a web application built by BankservAfrica, and the Sovereign Network, which is the world's first distributed ledger to be purpose-built for self-sovereign identity. Work has been done in collaboration with the South African Financial Blockchain Consortium, and thanks go to the following project partners: Absa Group Limited, BankservAfrica, and Old Mutual Limited. Welcome to the Know Your Customer concept demo. On the right side of the screen, you'll see the live view of the mobile device, which we'll be using first. On the left side is the bank website that we'll be using later in the process. When we open the Identity app for the first time, we need to choose how to protect the new identity wallet that we are creating. And for this, we'll use fingerprint biometrics. A new wallet is then initialized on the phone in secure storage. The Absa Identity app initializes using a connection already established with the bank. Through this, we can then apply for a national identity credential. The process starts by verifying the cell number of the handset to prove possession or ownership. This then is verified through a code sent via SMS to the user. We then enter that verification code that we've received via SMS. The next step is to enter the identity number and surname. This is then used to retrieve the corresponding official identity record from the government's Home Affairs National Identity System. The phone then prompts the user to do a facial recognition match by taking a selfie. This photo will then be compared with the photo that was taken during the country's recent national identity enrollment process. After a successful match, the data from the Home Affairs Identity System will be displayed on screen for the user to check and confirm. Absa then signs and issues this as a verifiable credential, which you can then save onto your device as part of your digital identity. We can also request a proof of residence, and this information is retrieved from various credit bureau sources. We can subsequently save that as another verified credential for later use. We now have a digital version of our national identity and residential address credentials, both of which are securely stored within the Identity app. In part 2, we go to the bank website section of the solution to open an account. We're presented with a QR code which we scan using the app on the mobile device. This creates a private channel directly with the bank, which then requests the necessary information to complete the application. The information is automatically retrieved from your digital wallet. Once the user confirms this, it's automatically uploaded to the bank. The user then clicks the Fill with Sovereign Identity button, and all the info is automatically loaded into the form. These fields are automatically marked as read-only with the sovereign logo to show the data is from a verified credential source. We then continue to capture the info in the rest of the form fields, i.e. that were not automatically populated, and we proceed with the application. And there we have it, a new bank account opened with your bank of choice. Note that a new FICA process was not required, as this information was already provided through the mobile identity app. The bank now gives you the option of getting an official proof of bank account credential to store in our digital identity wallet in the app, in addition to the ID and address details that are already there. As soon as the user confirms, you're prompted to save that credential. We can now use the proof of bank account credential later, for example, when applying for a loan or in any other scenario where we need to prove that we have a valid bank account. Over time, users can gather and store all sorts of other credentials in the wallet. For example, proof of educational qualifications like a university degree or matric certificate. It could also include a driver's license verification, proof of residence, and any other similar verifications that might be needed in our day-to-day lives. All of these can be gathered, stored, updated, and shared from the Identity wallet in a secure way whenever and wherever you need to.
Okay, so now I'll share the presentation that actually talks to the components of self-sovereign identity, and not specifically which technology can be utilized. So as we know, I mean, this cartoon was created in 1993, and today it still stands true.
We can't see your slides. So I think you're just sharing a different screen. Yes, we can see it now. Thank you. Perfect, thanks.
So, no problem. So this cartoon in itself was created in 1993 on the internet. Nobody knows you're a dog. And in today's world, that still stands true in the way we can create Facebook accounts or Gmail accounts and all of that type of stuff, as there is no actual proof that the person is the person that is actually working within that session. So, and this talks to the use of self-sovereign identity in the context of you have a issuer. In context of my identity, the golden source issuer would be Department of Home Affairs. And they would be part of this ecosystem. So for me to be able to start down this journey of creating a identity wallet, the first thing is to prove I am who I am. And that would take you through the process. You would have a wallet, or the holder as they refer to it. That is the individual in himself that actually manages that set of data. So all data that we are talking about is actually stored on the mobile device, and the user then has control as to whom he shares that data with. Then we have what we refer to as verifiers. So that's to whom the actual credentials are presented. So if we look in context of the video, it was the bank account or me opening a bank account. So I would present via scanning a QR code as an example, the set of data that is required to the verifier. And as part of this bottom piece of technology, the verifier will, as part of the cryptographic components, verify that it comes from a trusted issuer that is, and the actual wallet holder has been registered within the ecosystem. So you can't, for example, have an issuer of identity in your ecosystem that is not the golden source if you are looking for the highest trust level. So speaking to the trust level, for example, there's kind of 3 levels. One is when I self-attest to my identity. I take a selfie, I type in my data, that's me self-attesting. Then you've kind of got the medium one where you have different third parties attesting to you are who you say you are. From that context, it is still not the golden source that is who has issued your identity. That's part of that cycle. Very similar to proof of residence. There is no golden source currently that exists. It is either verified by a third party that has done a lot of data gathering and mining versus you as an individual that does a self-attesting that you're staying in an address. A proof of residence within the ecosystem, unless we get a golden source, can't go to the highest trust level. So the in identity, if it's to the Department of Home Affairs, that would be the highest trust level. And then whoever utilizes it then knows that the identity in itself has come from that golden source as the issuer. Then within the wallet itself, for it to exist in the ecosystem, there's a number of functions that the wallet would actually need to comply to for it to be functional within the ecosystem. In other words, it talks to things that we were referring to. So it must be able to, for example, resolve my identity. It must have the features of credential issuing. It must have features of credential maintenance, revocation. It must, for example, be able to suspend. So if I've got a proof of bank account that was issued by Bank A in my wallet, but I closed the bank account, but I want to continue with it in my wallet, the issuer would automatically revoke that credential within the ecosystem. So when I present it at the next verifier, when they do the authentication thereof on the ecosystem, it actually comes back and says these credentials have been revoked. So I can't use it. So where with today in a paper-based type environment, I print it from the bank, close, and then I go around using that piece of paper. And then, of course, to the other things, we were fraud detection, liveliness. So am I live at the point of the actual selfie taking place? But yes, these are components to make the wallet valid for use within this type of ecosystem to actually build up the trust. Lastly, it talks to governance, and Max also spoke to this. You've got two parts of the governance. One is the top part that talks to the human-centric component. So in other words, creating trust anchors, credential registries, governance authorities, the audit process. And then you've got the bottom piece, which is your technology, to make sure that the technology complies to the governance or has certain components to actually use the governance framework that has been set up on top. So your governance framework is made up of two components, one being the technology and one being the human-centric part. And these are fundamentally to the ecosystem. There is a number of these frameworks currently in play. The EU has created one, Canada has one, Singapore has one. And all of them are based on these bottom three components. They do have different types of rule sets as to what's the minimum trust level, maximum and top trust level. But that is specific to those jurisdictions. So in South Africa, we would have followed that type of governance framework, but we would have different rule sets within it because of our ecosystem within South Africa. And when you guys get the presentation, there's 4 additional sets of paper information that you can read up. The first one relates to Evidem. It is a very good video that kind of explains the technology components in a more business term from that perspective. It's on YouTube. It's about an hour long, so it does go into a lot of detail. There's the trust over IP components. They talk to machine readable governance. So in other words, when you actually set up your governance framework, a lot of it needs to be machine readable. Then, of course, it's the self-sovereign identity or the sovereign foundation in itself. And then there's a part that refers to the European self-sovereign identity work.
Super, thanks, Sean. That was really great and very exciting to see where things are heading and the progress that has been made. Portia, you have a question. Do you want to ask? Portia? I don't know if you can't unmute yourself. So maybe I'll just read it.
Okay.
Thanks. I think you've unmuted me. I didn't have the privilege of unmuting myself. Good afternoon, everyone. Sean, thank you for the presentation. Quite insightful. I'm just trying to understand the digital identity, what it's trying to address in terms of the larger ecosystem. Example, is it only in the financial sector or will it be able to address, for example, let's look at the Department of Health, where it can also be used to bring out my patient's records and it can be stored in there? Or for now, the focus is just to address the need in the financial sector? And if so, how expandable will it be?
So the focus is what Max was talking to. So I just kind of spoke to the capability. So from a issuance perspective, it could be proof of vaccination, could be proof of medical aid, it could be proof of SASSA grants, it could be, so once you've got the physical identity within the wallet, any type of credential then can be added to the wallet and then reused through the ecosystem depending on the verifier. So it is not just to the financial sector, it is to the actual broader ecosystem.
Pippa, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the security sort of capability of the digital ledger technology.
So are you within the self-sovereign ecosystem, and that's one of the reasons, and that's one of the reasons for, let's call it selecting within the DLT perspective. It does have a unique capability that talks to the cryptographic components that exist within it. And it also then builds on top of it things like zero knowledge proof. For example, if I need to prove I am over 18, then within the ecosystem calculations are done and the proof point I am over 18 is given, not necessarily my whole ID number. For example, proof of income. I can prove I earn between X and Y. I don't need to tell you I earn Z from that perspective. So the security in itself is inherent in the actual solution. It was built as part of the solution. It wasn't an afterthought. So the security, it is a different level of security that we know today through the way we sign with PKIs and that. It has a extensive cryptographic set of calculations within the solution itself.
Super, thanks, Sean. I mean, I think that's an important point to stress. So thank you very much for that presentation, and to Max as well. I'm going to hand over to Yoonyoung Cho, who's actually a senior economist that works on social protection and jobs global practice at the World Bank. Yoon is actually in Manila, so, you know, up till quite late. So thank you very much for accommodating us. And she's going to present specifically on social protection and beneficiary-centric design around and the case study in the Philippines. So Yoon, over to you. If I can ask you to keep it to 20 minutes, I know you've got a very long presentation, so thank you very much. Marceli, you're presenting, so you can go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And welcome you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me in this insightful workshop. I've been learning a lot, and I'm not sure this was really about the aspirational model, but it was really felt like a futuristic way to go. So great job, everyone who has been speaking. I think I will have to bring the attention to kind of 19th century model and going back and forth between 19th century and 21st century. So this case study is about the Philippine social protection program during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was curious about the Philippines and South Africa, so I just looked up. And so Philippines has like 100 million population, so slightly like 30% larger than South Africa. And in terms of GNI per capita, also, you know, Philippines has like 10K US dollars compared to South Africa, like 6,000. So the slightly higher income country in the Philippines, but Philippines is geographically, you know, spread it over 7,000 islands, and that could be part of the reason why the systems has been kind of lagging. But in terms of the context, the government introduced very large-scale COVID-19 response, social amelioration program, and it aimed to cover 3 out of 4 households in the country. So 18 million households in the country was aimed to be covered. And the country has very good system of social assistance. Pantawid Pamilyang Filipino program we call 4Ps is kind of textbook type, health, nutrition, and education conditional cash transfer. And it covers about 1/5 of households, like 20% of the entire households. For these populations and beneficiaries, they have been doing digital payment through the land bank owned by the government. And 4P's beneficiaries became automatically part of the social amelioration program during pandemic. And but 4P's beneficiaries households were about 4 million, and they aimed to provide these subsidies to 18 million. So apart from these 4 million households, 14 million, there was really no mechanism to identify and find these people from the government perspective. Usually the countries like the South Africa case, the countries are utilizing the registry to identify beneficiaries' information, or utilize the national ID, digital ID, to really cross-match databases and verify and validate the information. Unfortunately, the Philippines, the Listana, which is the country's registry, was really outdated, like constructed 6 years ago. And the national ID was not in place. It was very nascent stage that no one really had national ID yet. So in the end, government was struggling to find a way to identify this additional 14 million households. And in the end, they introduced the manual process, really paper and pen. Everyone lined up in the government office, and they started writing their name and address and all sorts of information. And then they did a physical cash delivery. Some people might find it shocking, and I was in the same boat. So I'm sitting in Manila, in this Philippines that has nice social assistance program, and kind of higher middle income country has introduced this paper process, and a lot of people lining up in the office. Was really, that image was shocking. Next slide, please. The picture might say everything to you. So this is the scene that we observed during the pandemic when they introduced the lockdown, but lockdown really didn't stop people from coming to the local office to apply for this assistance and submit their paper form that they wrote down their names. Next, please. So this kind of struggle really highlighted the need for strengthening social protection system strengthening. So the World Bank introduced Beneficiary First Social Protection Project. And FIRST stands for Fast, Innovative, and Responsive Service Transformation. This is not my slide. The Beneficiary First Social Protection Project has two objectives. One is really immediate objective of addressing the COVID-19 stress for 4P's beneficiaries and existing social assistance beneficiaries. The other is really strengthening the social protection delivery systems. Thank you. This is the right screen. So the short-term COVID-19 response and support for 4Ps is the primary objective, and then the second, more medium-term objective of this project is social protection system strengthening, and we really highlight the three aspects: digital ID, digital data governance, including the registry, and digital payment. So the studies that I'm going to present today quickly is going to be part of digital government to persons G2P agenda. Next slide, please. So the objective of this study is really document the lessons learned from COVID-19 response. So the first tranche of social amelioration program was kind of difficult, as you have seen the pictures. They introduced some of the innovations in the second tranche, and some of the innovations include working with financial service providers, and they introduced large-scale digital payment. So the focus area of this study is really the beneficiary registration process and payment delivery. So we carried out qualitative study and quantitative study. Qualitative study was really by working with government, the Department of Social Welfare Development, and central bank and financial service providers who participated in this digital payment journey. The quantitative survey really looked into the beneficiaries' experience, and we learned from their reporting. So the data collection happened between November 2022, January 21 for the interviews with the financial service providers, and actual beneficiary survey happened later. So what we think that some of what worked well is clear eligibility criteria. There are many financial service providers, but central bank and governments kind of laid out clear eligibility criteria for joining this consortium of financial service providers. So they selected 6 of them. 3 are kind of traditional banks. The other 3 are e-money issuers. And very small scale, but at least they introduced online registration, learning from the experience that paper-based application form and handwriting is not necessarily the best one. So they introduced online registration, but it was very small scale, but it opened the door for scale up later. And they utilize a payment infrastructure. So working with these financial service providers doesn't mean that you have to go to their bank branches. You can utilize their bank networks, small stores or 7-Eleven, or we call sari-sari store in the villages. And then because Philippines has a lot of islands in the remote areas, you can use the remittances center or some other sorts of pawn shops that are doing a lot of financial transactions. They are part of networks of digital payments. So the beneficiaries were able to utilize those contact points. And of course, the largest scale of social amelioration program, even though they did a physical cash delivery and a lot of manual process, over 20 million households were covered by this program, one of the largest in the world. Next, please. But there are many limitations, as you can imagine, that they introduced this kind of large-scale digital payment within a couple of months. So the first challenge, which was main challenge, was really beneficiary registration and data quality. Even if they introduced digital payment through financial service providers, their information of beneficiaries still came from beneficiaries' paper handwritten application form. And some are not really legible, others are mixed with different formats, and they provided not their phone number, but their neighbor's phone number, so there are a lot of duplications. So in the end, the data quality really hampered the efforts for digital payments. The government record shows that 30 to 35% of data had a duplicate mobile numbers, and it was difficult to transfer funds to that. And they had to reintroduce the manual process or physical cash delivery. And of course, when you are withdrawing the funds from the banks or e-money from e-wallet or their networks, you have to provide their ID, and government issued ID sometimes are difficult to provide. There was no national ID, and there are many different kinds of ID that are available in the country. So sometimes, some financial service providers accept certain IDs, others don't, so that could have been a challenge for some beneficiaries. So we have gone through some of the beneficiary journey mapping. It depends on the banks or the EMI, slightly different. And the business process is also different depending on the mobile phone ownership, whether you have mobile phone or not, and whether your phone is smartphone or not. But in each and every step, there are certain pain points, and we kind of map that journey, and it can inform the later for the really beneficiary-centric design for future improvement. Next slide, please. So next slide is similar journey mapping for e-money issuers when you have the e-wallet on your phone, and especially when you have the smartphone, it is a lot easier. Still, there are certain pain points that the government has to overcome in the near future. Next, please. In addition to these qualitative studies and some of the struggles that we have seen from the implementer's perspective, we also investigated the beneficiaries' experience through this survey. Next slide, please. Beneficiaries survey itself is providing very important lessons, but in terms of carrying out the survey, it was also revealing many challenges. One is the government is maintaining two different types of data. One is based on the paper application, so beneficiary information. That is one that was kept by the program implementers. The other one is the other part of the same department, but they are working with the financial service providers. So they have different data set that is coming from the financial sector. And there is no unique ID, and there's because there is no national ID, it is really difficult to match these two data sets. And in the end, we were trying to match with the demographic matching and fuzzy matching. Next slide, please. And you can imagine that the matching rate has been very low, and a lot of people provided duplicate phone numbers, and so the data quality is another issue that was again revealed by this exercise. And a lot of people are reporting that their income is super high, and there was no mechanism really to cross-check their self-reported income to other administrative data as presented earlier. There was kind of big bottleneck. Next slide, please. And this is the Excel files. Some people might think that Excel file is really not the data, but this is the data provided by financial sectors. And depending on banks or EMIs, different types of banks provided different types of Excel file with different formats, and there is really no way of organizing the clean beneficiary data of their transactions. Next slide, please. And if you are familiar with the Filipino names, it's very difficult to figure out. But if you see Joel or Ambrosio, and barangay is a kind of their local village level kind of unit, we have the suspicion that Joel Oliva Ambrosio in the same barangay is the same person. Maybe there is a typo in their handwriting, but there is no way that we can match these people are the same or not. This is for our survey purpose, for sampling purpose. We are doing this exercise, but this is real life experience the government is handling, and this is why there is emphasis on the importance of digital ID, national ID, the foundational ID, and data governance. Next slide, please. So through the fuzzy matching and name matching, we, in the end, figured out the sampling scheme, and then we carried out the survey. Next, please. We can move on to the next slide. The point is that, we received a lot of observations from the administrative data, but in the end, the match data was very small. And that was reflecting part of the difficulties. And we are showing the 6 service providers. Gcash and PayMaya are the 2 biggest e-money issuers in the country. A lot of people are using it. StarPay is another e-money issuers. And Union Bank, RCBC, Robinsons Bank, these are kind of more traditional banks. And majority of them utilize this e-money and e-wallet for their receiving their benefits. Next, please. I think in all this digital payment and digital ID and etc., the ownership of the phone and especially the smartphone is very, very important. And we looked into that, and we are still investigating whether the households have access to the phone. And majority of them have access to at least one phone. And is it yours? A lot of people say that they are owning the phone, but among them, about 60% or less are owning the smartphone. So, it is not small share, but to make a kind of universal digital payment, there is a way to go. Only 60% of them are saying that they own the smartphone. So there should be some mechanism to address for those who do not own the phone or do not own the smartphone in the digital payment, especially for social assistance. Next slide, please. And a lot of people are familiar with their phone. They are using it every day, and especially the Filipinos are really known for utilizing the phone for social network. The Facebook ownership is the world highest in the Philippines. So they are familiar with those, but not necessarily other services. Next slide, please. So if you look at the usage of your phone, a lot of people are using their phone for social networking and messaging, but they are not using it for financial services or online market transactions. Next, please. And financial awareness also, a lot of transactions, even wage payment in the country is generally based on cash. Not many people are receiving digital payments, and it's really cash-based society that could have affected their usage for digital payment and familiarity as well. And a lot of beneficiaries in this setting are, self-employed, and they are receiving their benefits for wage employment in cash. Next, please. And I'm showing this because these people, the beneficiaries, are in financial distress. Many of them are saying that they will not be able to come up with 1 month of subsistence level cash because they are under financial distress. So we are also looking at the very vulnerable populations in this context. Next slide, please. So we started asking about their program awareness. Are you familiar with the social amelioration program? Do you know the amount that you should receive? So a lot of people are aware of the program itself, and then they are also aware of some of the banks or EMIs that they are working with. But the 41% of people are saying that, they are receiving money from pawn shops. So, they are naming their network agents rather than their financial service providers. So they started showing a little bit of limited knowledge on the financial sector. Next, please. And we probe further into their financial knowledge. A lot of people are saying that this financial account is for receiving government subsidies only. So if you look at Gcash owners, they are saying that 68% of them said that there are other features, but the rest, blue bar was showing that, it is only for receiving government subsidies. So the general financial literacy is quite low, and they are not really familiar with what to do about the bank account or e-money account. Next, please. So we also asked about the program experience. Generally, program satisfaction is really good. The only thing I want to mention is that a lot of people still have to travel outside of their village to withdraw money. So still travel time, even if this digital payment improved the access to contact points and payment points, it is still kind of far, and there is travel cost. Next, please. And in terms of queuing time, you can see that it varies a lot by the financial service providers. Overall, they had to wait for 2 hours, even if it is digital payments. It is not very different from physical cash delivery. In some sense, they are, they find it more convenient that they can just pop by in their, local office to pick up their benefits. So it takes time and efforts and energy to get familiarized with the financial service providers and digital payment. And also processing-wise, digital payment should be improved so that it can reduce the travel time, processing time, and queuing time. Next, please. We can move on to this. So based on this qualitative and quantitative study, we are saying that the Philippines is really at the juncture of making leapfrogging efforts in the digital G2P payments. Next slide, please. We typically classify G2P 1.0 to 4.0. 1.0 is really kind of traditional setting. One program gives out physical cash. That's the first tranche of COVID-19 response in the country. And G2P 2.0, single program utilizing single service provider using digital payments. That's the Pantawid Pamilyang Filipino program, the country's safety net program. And then during the pandemic, they introduced multiple financial service providers for single program. That's G2P 3.0. So in the one country, there are multiple different modalities, and there is a really opportunity and huge recognition in the country to really leapfrog into G2P 4.0, where many programs can be utilized and consumers have the choice to choose their financial service providers of their own convenience and choice. Next slide, please. For that to happen, I think the shared infrastructure is really important. Digital ID, digital payment infrastructure, and digital data governance infrastructure is going to be very important to make that beneficiary-centric G2P 4.0, where beneficiaries can access to any service providers of their choice for withdrawing G2P and for future financial inclusion. I have very specific policy recommendations, but I think it is more relevant for the Philippine audience than here. So let me stop here. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Yoon. That was excellent, and similar challenges that we've experienced in South Africa as well. So a very nice case study. I'm just going to open up to questions. Hungry, can you unmute yourself? I'm going to try and unmute you so that you can ask your question to Sean.
Everyone can unmute themselves.
Thanks. Hungry, can you maybe let me just ask it in the meantime. So Sean, the question is this digital wallet under self-sovereign identity as bulletproof secure as suggested? It feels like if someone gets hold of a wallet, one is really exposed.
So that's a loaded question, that one. So it is different to your physical wallet being stolen. So if you take in today's world from a physical perspective, if you've got, for example, the old green ID book, somebody steals it, they can skim, put their photo on it, and they then have technically stolen your identity details. When it comes to the wallet itself, when we went through the actual features of the wallet itself, the features have been put in place to protect against that type of thing taking place. So if you have a look at the liveliness test, have a look at the matching that takes place between the golden source, in this case Department of Home Affairs, and the image taken at that point in time. There's a match that takes place. And that's when I create my wallet. When I use my wallet, and depending on the use case, the workflow within that use case can actually prompt me to do a liveliness test again. So even if my wallet is now stolen, and because I mean it's my phone that gets stolen, the individual utilizing the phone would first need to get through all the passcodes. Secondly, depending on what use case he's following, he has to present his face again. And he can't steal your face. That's the difference between the current world and the new digital world. In the current world, They don't steal your face. They just put their face in place of yours. In the new world, they can't do that due to the fact of the verification of that facial image going forward. I hope that answers the question.
So linked to that, Sean, I mean, what about things like spoofing, which is quite, I mean, you look at sort of SnapScan and you can do all sorts of filters. I mean, how do you sort of circumvent that?
That's where the liveliness piece comes in. It is it needs to be part of. So part of the trust framework is to make sure any wallets that are introduced into the ecosystem does have a ISO approved liveliness component to it that actually takes care of spoofing, takes care of 3D printing type images, wax images and that type of stuff, spoofed videos, deep fake. It does have a capability of actually identifying the difference. I'm not saying they won't get it right somewhere in the future, but I mean, as time goes along, that set of technology continuously improves.
Super, thanks. I mean, maybe just a question to Anna, and we'll probably go about 2 minutes over. Just in terms of like the security, so two questions. One is, in your experience, and I'm probably asked you this before, but like your experience of digital identity, is it often driven by the private sector? I mean, you see sort of the importance of, you know, eKYC in the case that Max puts up for South Africa, where there's a huge need for it and it starts there. And then it has the sort of spillovers and externalities that you see in other sectors and government catching on. Or is it driven sort of by government, which then sort of spills over into the private sector? And then, so that's the first question. And the second question really is around sort of digital security. I mean, how do we address digital identity specifically in a cybercrime space? We know that identity theft is probably the largest form of cybersecurity that there is. You know, what does the World Bank put in place when they go into countries and they introduce ID4D, for example, to make sure that you address digital identity specifically?
Thanks, Kathy. So on the first question as to the drivers of digital identity, I think it's very much coming from both sectors. So obviously the financial sector, as you said, there is a lot of demand and also kind of requirements based on international regulations for facilitating kind of robust identity checks, but also have nowadays to facilitate, as Sean and Max demonstrated, kind of account opening online and making it easier for people to access new financial products. So there is that driver there, but also from the public sector, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, and as was also the case in South Africa, where the public sector was trying to roll out a rapid response. If there was already a mechanism in place to authenticate people without physical presence, that really helped with rolling out these programs quickly. And also, if there was interoperability between different databases, that helped with all the eligibility checks to make sure that these the assistance is going to the intended beneficiaries. And beyond, social assistance, we're also seeing applications and things like making it easier to open businesses. So still like business registration, which would be on the public sector side, but obviously helping the private sector, helping the economy expand, as well as all kinds of loan applications, even in for health, kind of trying to, for telehealth and telemedicine, both ones offered by the private sector and the public sector, there is a lot of demand for digital ID. So it really cuts across service delivery. And then to your second question on cybersecurity and how the World Bank is supporting that, as also mentioned in the presentation, we're really trying to look at it from all aspects. So depending on where a particular country's capabilities are, one starting point could be on the legal side, like if there is no cybercrime or cybersecurity legislation, to make